Welcome to the first lecture in drawing translation for summer 2021. I'm your instructor, Zach, and this is the primer lecture in the course, which is going to introduce you to essential concepts. First, I just want to say that if you've never drawn anything from observation before, that this course is about seeing more than it is precision. So we first have to understand that drawing is not about replication and making something look exactly how it appears in real life. It's more about the translation process, hence the title of this course. And that process is where we get to express really almost things that we can't put into words about ourselves, because through drawing, we translate objects and then we represent them as we see them and as we sort of, if you will, feel them in the world. So this first lecture, we're going to think more critically about that process, and rather than just arriving at something that looks like something else, how does drawing actually translate what we're encountering in our day-to-day lives? I'll start with a quote. "The process of drawing is, before all else, the process of putting visual intelligence into action, the very mechanics of visual thought." Now, this next part, please forgive the gender-specific pronouns. "Unlike painting and sculpture, drawing is the process by which the artist makes clear to himself and not to the spectator what he is doing. It is a soliloquy before it becomes communication." This last part about a soliloquy, I want to focus on for just a minute, because drawing is often something that is used to communicate with others, but it's also very personal. So again, we have to kind of get to know ourselves and know our own kind of style and capabilities of drawing and embrace that, because otherwise, unless we're having that conversation with ourselves about what we're drawing and how we're doing it, then it's definitely not going to have a great communication value to others. So going back to the first part of this quote, the very mechanics of visual thought, I want you to think about drawing in this course as processing what's around us, and using drawing as a way of better understanding the forms and all of how they're connected in the world around us. Because by using our hands and our eyes at the same time, we're kind of feeling our way through the world, but the result is, putting marks down on paper or another kind of substrate. This, by the way, is by Michael Ayrton, who is a practicing designer in the US. Okay, next we can think about drawing as a process of actual design if we kind of map the design thinking model onto a scribble. And again, please forgive maybe the nature of the scribble. It was done in PowerPoint, and if I had to go back in time, I would do it by hand and scan it in. But this is really it's a diagram for illustration purposes. So I want you to think about drawing a scribble and kind of finding your way out of the scribble. And what I mean by that is actually thinking as you're moving your hand and creating line. And if we put this into a couple of rough categories, at the beginning of the scribble, we're not sure what we're making. We're more or less thinking, instead of that saying thinking out loud, meaning to kind of ramble and talk your way through something. Drawing can be a kind of writing or mark making that is symbolic of our thinking pattern. So we can kind of think onto the page in a way. And so through that, we might start really randomly and not really have much of anything. And then we might see some kind of repetition, some sort of pattern. And then we gain insight about that by actually doing it and developing it. And as we move through that motion, we gain clarity and focus, and eventually we arrive at, this is more metaphoric, but the line that we were looking for. And then we can move on to creating something that's more, not precise per se, but focused. So the focus increases. Now, if we think about this with the design thinking model, which is iterative and also moves in a cycle. So we research, we form a concept, we create a prototype, and we design it, and then we test it. This would be the next phase. and then we move back to the beginning and start that over again as iteration. So we can also recognize this in this scribble, metaphorically again, where the research phase is the really tough, gummy part that takes us quite a while to figure out what we're actually looking at. We form a concept, which is kind of a sample of this. And then we make a prototype, which is a little wobbly, not quite there, but at least it gets us closer. And then the design is what we end up with after we've distilled all of that information. So drawing is both, again, symbolically, but also practically, meaning that you actually do it and experience this process and sort of think through ideas in this way. It's really important to your creativity. I should say, the capacity of your creativity as a designer to embrace drawing as another way to think through what you're doing with your hands and your eyes. Okay, now I want to look at some really specific levels of what drawing can be that may not be obvious. So we're going to again move away from the idea of how good a drawing is. And again, I speak about that in terms of replication, so copying what we see. And drawing actually has other functions that we acknowledge, but we don't acknowledge consciously all the time. And in this course, we really want to focus on those and try to, if we can, elevate that in the ways that we engage with drawing and design. So drawing, let's think about it in all of these different ways, and I'll give you some examples after this slide. First, we kind of alluded to this on the previous slide, a mode of iterative design. So we can make many, many versions of things as part of the design process. As also a means of recording and documenting the world around us. Again, not photorealistically all the time, but that is one possibility of drawing. A condensation of space and time. A way of mark making, and I put in brackets here the human element because everybody's drawing style is different depending not only on the tools they use and the sort of way that we see, but also our physiognomy, the way that our hands work and our wrists and all of that stuff. And I'll come back to this point in a minute. And then lastly, a method to simplify and deconstruct objects. So take things apart and kind of better understand how they're made. So let's look at some examples. Iteration. Repetition of a process based on previous attempts in order to arrive at a more successful solution. So if we look at all of these different ink drawings of pineapples, yes, they all represent a pineapple, but they have different ways of doing it, and some could be argued to be more successful or more visually interesting than others. But it's only through making all of these different versions and exploring variations on a theme through drawing that we can quickly figure out either what is the most successful solution or develop a system and then use that. Some would call this a motif, where we have many different versions of something that all kind of end up in our final design, but the variations between them actually create the visual interest. And iteration, again, going back to design thinking, is about this looping. So drawing something and then putting it aside, drawing it again, putting it aside, but then coming back to it and maybe seeing things that you didn't see while you were actually making it and pulling those out and then emphasizing those as part of a design process. This one's probably a little bit more obvious. To record the world around us. So if we think about a record, there are two common definitions: as a noun, a piece of evidence about the past, and as a verb, to make permanent for later reference. And drawing, no matter how accurate it is, or might be to its subject, does both of these things. So by sort of taking what we see and externalizing it and bringing it outside of ourselves, we make permanent something that we can later refer to. But whatever it is that we're drawing, even if it's not that realistic, it still speaks to the past and whatever that moment was in which you were creating it. Okay, this is one of my favorites, and we don't think about this too often. This comes back to that idea of the human element. Drawing can be an index, and index in this context means the physical trace of an object or process. And I give an example here, footprints in the snow. So it's not an inscription that's permanent often. It can be very temporary, but especially when we think about the human element, evidence of the hand of a person's body and their physical presence is something that drawing does, just innately, on a base level. But we can also kind of shift our understanding of what drawing can be, and the example that I'm showing you here is a really interesting one. So what we're looking at on the left is the backside of a wooden door with a big glass pane in it, and it has all of these stickers stuck to it. But what the artist slash designer was more interested in here, if you look a little bit closer, you can see some gray, sort of charcoal colored streaks in that left side photograph. Those are actually tape marks, the gunk from the tape from previous things that have been put up on the glass and then removed. And what this person did was to actually trace them, then bring it into Illustrator and then vectorize them. And so what we're looking at on the right is a composition, or some would say a pattern, that is made out of the index of that tape. Because again, the tape is gone and the person may no longer be there either, but we can see the evidence of their interaction with the glass and the tape through these marks that really couldn't be arrived at any other way. They're quite detailed even when they look deceivingly simple. Okay, maybe another obvious one here, but it's important to highlight, so I won't spend too much time on it. Condensation. So through drawing, we can kind of fuse two or more images or ideas into a single composite or new image. And what I mean by new image is that sometimes by fusing those two different kind of times and spaces into the same plane through drawing, we create an unanticipated outcome, a new perspective on something that we couldn't have seen without that drawing process. And again, you could do this with photography, but there's a sensitivity with drawing where sometimes the choices that we make in how we combine different images is more careful than it would be if we were kind of combining things digitally, because we don't, of course, have that Command Z button to go back in time conveniently. And so we have to be really deliberate about the choices that we're making when we combine different times and spaces. Okay, mark making. This kind of aligns with index, but it can also be, and this is what I want to talk about, is just focusing on the quality of the marks themselves and seeing the beauty in that. What's created through the hand and the implement when we join with tools and we try to create something that, even when we're striving to be perfect, we can see that the marks are irregular. And learning to see the beauty in that, and as a graphic designer, being able to pull out what are the most sort of, again, graphically interesting marks. And what I mean by that, you'll explore actually in detail in your second project for this course. But it means appreciating a mark as a kind of icon or symbol on its own and trying to find, if you will, the natural design process that happens when we're not trying to make something, but when we can come back to it with a designer's eye and pull that out and then recontextualize it in one of our other projects. And so that's kind of what you see here with the red on the left, are marks that were made by charcoal but then have been sort of digitally sampled out and pulled over to the left. And then we can appreciate them as texture, as shape, as value, more than just a mark. They take on sort of, just abstract beauty in that way. Okay, sorry, I mulled over this definition, but to break it down simply, the practice of generating graphic marks, shapes, and patterns using different materials and tools. So again, you don't need to memorize this definition, but if this is a little bit mystifying, this mark making thing, don't worry, because again, you'll be exploring it in detail in Module 2 of this course. And actually, I just wanted to include this example briefly to really be clear that in this kind of drawing that I'm discussing, this is actually a very lovely drawing because it is from observation and it does achieve depth and have detail to it. But as you can see, it's quite erratic, it's done quickly, but the marks themselves, the pen that's used here, and the slight differences in width and pressure, and also the kind of personality that comes through in some of the scribbliness of the line is really lovely. And this is the kind of thing that we do want to be prioritizing when we're talking about drawing in this course. Okay, the last one in terms of one of those kind of big drawing as a certain method is deconstruction. And this one also may be obvious, but this is more about how we see when we draw rather than what we actually create in the drawing itself. So we have this example here of it might be a wolf or it might be a husky or a Malamute or some kind of, dog breed that is very close to the wolf family. And you may not consider this drawing, but it really is if you think about it as a process. So first, we're going to, before we can get to this detailed silhouette that makes it super recognizable, we have to first break it down into smaller shapes and then see how they're connected to one another. So through drawing as deconstruction, we take things apart in a way that makes them easier to apprehend. And apprehend means to both understand, but also to receive information as well. So we see more and we see better when we draw in this kind of deconstructive way. To analyze pieces of a whole in a way that emphasizes their relationships to one another. So again, connection, and we can start to see pattern and proportion. This will be important in your first assignment in this course because we're going to engage with the figure, and there's definitely a deconstruction process that has to happen in order to be able to see how, the size of the head, and we're going to be looking at humans, but you can do this with almost any, any piece of anatomy, how the size of the head actually relates to the size of the other joints in the body and how those shapes might either be similar or a little different. So to be able to make that analysis, we have to deconstruct the larger image first as we draw. And just to give you a little preview, I wanted to include these couple of sketches by Helen South because we're going to be looking at the figure, but also some details of the figure like hands. And this, again, so I can't emphasize this enough, I think that these are actually lovely drawings because they express way more. They manage to communicate form, but what they're doing is that they're engaging mark making and different forms of line, as well as also thinking about how to show what the eye is doing and the kind of thought process as you're figuring out where something ends, where it begins, how big it is, what angle it's at. You can see that especially with this example on the right, where we're kind of using bigger lines to box in the shape of the palm. And these have energy and they have a graphic level of interest that is, I would rather look at, honestly, than, the most precise technical pen drawing of a hand, because these actually show the human element again. And so to be able to see that process of translating the image into something that it, yes, represents what it is, but doesn't need to do that so precisely is the kind of sweet spot that we want to be in for assignments in this course. Okay, I just want to end with a couple of inspirational quotes that speak to some of the things that I've brought up. So the first is by a 20th century French photographer who actually came to drawing late in his life, Henri Cartier-Bresson, and he was considered a humanist photographer, so he really liked the human subject. But it wasn't until the 1970s that he started to explore drawing and actually considered it not superior to photography, but definitely something that photography could not actually do, that only drawing could do. And he said once, "Photography is an immediate reaction. Drawing is a meditation." And whether you necessarily agree with the wording or not, what he's talking about is photography happens quickly. It's a fleeting moment that we're trying to capture, and it's only there for a second or two. So it's a very kind of rushed and hurried pattern of thinking. Whereas drawing as a meditation is about slowing down and really kind of, getting that good osmosis of the internal sense to the external sense. How do we think and see about things in ways that no one else can really understand because they can't be inside our heads? But how do we express it? Because we manage to draw and put what's happening in our mind down on paper or on the screen. So really think about the value in that meditative kind of space. And then lastly, David Hockney, who is a famous painter from the San Francisco Bay Area, once said, "Drawing takes time. A line has time in it." So again, thinking about drawing as a way of not only documenting what we're drawing, the thing, the subject, but also a moment in our lives and a moment in history. And that's not something that we're going to conceptually explore in this course, but I will kind of bring up this idea of capturing time within a drawing again as we move through all the various modules. Okay, well, I hope that you're excited for this course. I'm excited to get, really dive deeper into some of these themes. And if you have any questions about this lecture or want to leave a comment, please do. I'm always happy to, clarify or jam in a few more helpful references where I can. Okay, thanks everybody. Take care.